If there is anything Westeros does better than killing each other, it's dusting itself off, standing up, and pretending absolutely nothing happened. After a winter of blood and steel, after banners torn to shreds fluttering above fields littered with horse corpses, the first thing people do is not bury the dead. Oh no. The first thing they do is rewrite the narrative. We won. Obviously, we won. A declaration echoed from all 5 kings, men who, ironically, did not even have a single peaceful morning to check whether their own map still showed the same borders. But that is the nature of post-war Westeros, not a time for rest, but a time to patch holes in the system and see what's still usable. Some lords were already scheduling new council meetings while their castles were still literally smoking. In Westeros, people regularly confuse surviving with winning. Sometimes, simply waking up without a sword lodged in your chest is enough to qualify as a glorious victory. While the High Lords are busy rearranging chairs in council chambers freshly scrubbed of blood, let us look at a forgotten corner. An endless sheet of white where Samwell Tarly, the Night's Watch brother unanimously described as nothing special, is trying very hard to breathe. And that's fair. Sam doesn't have any extraordinary skill besides not dying. Out here, on the razor's edge between life and annihilation, not dying is sometimes a rare talent. Sam, stumbling through the snow, looks exactly like a buggy program running loops before crashing. A noble-born son shipped to the wall like unwanted luggage. A man with no speed, no strength, and even less ability to make fast decisions. And yet today, Sam is alive. Meanwhile, the ones who ran faster, fought harder, and roared louder are all lying behind him. Sam doesn't outrun the White Walkers, the storyteller might whisper. He only outruns the version of himself from yesterday. And sometimes, at the very end of the world, that's enough. Because what's chasing Sam is unlike any army you can find in the Chronicles. It is the cavalry of death, silent, breathless, unflinching, a campaign with no negotiations, no truce, no economy strong enough to restrain its march. If the War of the 5 Kings was a battlefield for resources, pride, and power, then this war is something else entirely, a collision between biology and extinction. Meanwhile, down south, people are still arguing about who won. In King's Landing, the nobles drink themselves silly after Blackwater as if they personally pushed the wildfire ship into Stannis' fleet. In the north, Robb Stark is praised as the undefeated young king, even though his alliances are dissolving faster than rock salt thrown into water. Over at Dragonstone, Stannis sits by the fire, reciting every little detail he believes proves destiny chose him. Everyone crowns themselves as the one blessed by the gods, and in every one of those smiles, there's a tiny crack they desperately try to hide. The sad and hilarious truth is that the maps are the only honest things during this period. Maps don't lie. Maps don't promise victory. Maps just sit there quietly while the kingdoms are chewed apart by royal incompetence and winter's cruelty. Read a post-war map of Westeros, and you don't see borders, you see wounds. Yet in this chaos, Westeros presents its trademark dark humor, the contrast between triumphant ballads and the reality Sam is enduring. One side has overflowing wine and music echoing through grand halls. The other has the ragged breathing of a clumsy soldier running until his lungs feel like they'll burst. Place those two scenes side by side, and you realize the bitter truth of history. The people making life and death decisions are always the farthest from the actual battlefield. And still, there is something colder than death out in the snow, the feeling of being forgotten. Sam knows this well. The Night's Watch is always short on men, short on food, short on respect, but never short on death. The only thing faster than death itself may just be the 7 kingdoms' indifference toward the wall that has protected them for thousands of years. In the middle of Sam's desperate steps, there's a line that slips out, barely audible. War of the Five Kings. 5 kings went to war, but the biggest winner was chaos. That isn't just mockery. It's the truth of post-war Westeros. Chaos is the only enemy that needs no army, yet always gains territory. It slips through every gap the kings leave behind with each failed decision. It seeps into the soil, into human hearts, until the entire realm becomes a chessboard on which no one has enough pieces left to play. And as with every opening chapter of a grand tragedy, this part does not end with a revelation, but with a hanging question. Sam is alive, but how many in the South understand that his survival is the first siren call? The war between men has quieted, but the war against the darkness has only just begun. While Sam is running for his life through a blizzard not far away, Jon Snow is facing a different kind of storm, a storm of questions. And strangely enough, some questions are far more terrifying than an army marching under the White Walkers. They don't kill you outright. They strip your truth away, piece by piece. Jon is traveling with the Wildlings, and somehow every step he takes sounds like a knock on the door of his own fate. The cold bites into his skin, but it is Ygritte's eyes, sharp as a blade honed on truth, that chill him the most. Because here, where freedom is breathed in like air, lies are the easiest things to spot. He knows he's playing the role of a Night's Watch traitor. And the biggest issue is not that he's bad at acting. The problem is, he's too convincing in certain moments, not fully believing, not fully lying. A gray zone Jon himself can't quite place. People lie best when they don't believe a word they say. But Jon, whose heart is far too honest to fool anyone, ends up making people believe him precisely because of that confusion. It's the kind of paradox that only happens when an honest man is forced to wear a mask. Jon's not good at lying, Ygritte says, her voice light like a tease but tinged with amusement. Lucky for you in the wild, no one tells the truth anyway. She's right. Here, trust isn't built on logic but instinct. No laws to cite, no capital to hide behind, no wall to shelter you. Only snow, wind, and the Wildlings' biggest question for Jon. So whose side are you really on? The job interview begins simply enough. Tormund eyes Jon up and down like he's evaluating a horse he might buy. Rattleshirt wants to kill Jon immediately, the kind of interview candidate who sabotages the competition. And finally, Mance Rayder. King beyond the wall, the man who traded the honor of the Night's Watch for something called freedom, sits there in silence, watching Jon like he watches a man who just stepped into a circle of fire without noticing the flames licking at his boots. The interview consists of exactly 2 questions, perfectly matching the brutal minimalism of the wild. Do you hate the Night's Watch? Cold, isn't it? The second one is easier to answer, but both are dangerous. One wrong answer can get you killed. One right answer can also get you killed. Jon replies slowly, I've seen them kill their own men. I've seen them shut their eyes to the death creeping down from the north. Half truth, half lie. A response sturdy enough to buy him a few more hours, or kill him on the spot, depending on the listener's mood. Mance Rayder looks at Jon with the gaze of a man who has stood on both sides of the wall. He knows the truth is always messier than a slogan, and he knows something Jon hasn't dared articulate. A man only leaves the Night's Watch when he is deeply disappointed, or when he is playing a role far more dangerous than he can handle. You're right, Mance says, quietly. But being right doesn't make you safe. That's the Wildlings in a nutshell. They don't care much about words. They care about how a man stands in the wind, keeps his eyes steady, and breathes without breaking. Honesty here doesn't live in speech. It lives in posture. Ygritte, the only one who sees clearly the cracks beneath Jon's facade, looks at him like she's staring at a report missing half the data. Pretty, but useless. She laughs. You're not a bad man, Jon Snow, but good men don't last long out here. It isn't comfort, it's prognosis. In the darkness beside the crackling fire, Jon listens as Ygritte talks about freedom, something he has never truly owned. In the Night's Watch, he was bound by oath. In the north, he was bound by duty. But here, where ice and fire blend, the only thing tying Jon to the world is Ygritte, a thread thin, beautiful, and dangerously easy to snap. Love, something Jon never considered an important variable, becomes his biggest weakness. Nothing crumbles faster than the heart of someone who has never been loved, and Ygritte, with her brutal honesty, makes it impossible for Jon to tell where the mission ends and the feelings begin. If the Night's Watch is the religion of duty, then the Wildlings are the religion of instinct. And Jon now stands between two religions he neither fully believes in nor can completely reject. When Mance Rayder finally accepts Jon, it isn't trust. It is merely a postponement of execution. Out here, surviving one more day is a kind of victory. Jon draws a deep breath. The cold slices into his lungs like a reminder. He is not safe yet, not forgiven, not believed. He is simply not dead. And sometimes at the end of the world, that alone is a luxury. Ygritte's voice rises behind him, half warning, half teasing, half sincere. Don't overthink it, Jon Snow. You know, that's not really your thing. And just like that, in the middle of a storm, caught between unfinished lies and truths he cannot speak, Jon steps into a destiny he himself doesn't fully understand. There is nothing more tragic than a young king beginning his reign with victory, because victory is the sneakiest kind of poison. It makes people overconfident, and overconfidence is the front door through which all stupid decisions happily stroll in. Robb Stark is living proof. A brilliant warrior, a talented strategist, and a man who utterly fails at managing people. And a history, from Westeros to the real world, has made one thing painfully clear. Losing a battle is dangerous, but losing your allies is basically signing your own death certificate. After the flaming, thunderous battles, Robb stands over the map of the North like a fresh gust of wind, strong, intelligent, charismatic enough that even seasoned warriors look at him with hope. But maps do not speak. Maps do not warn. And maps certainly don't remind Robb that defeating the Lannister armies does not mean he has tamed the stubborn, unpredictable nature of northern lords. The map stays quiet, and that silence is something Robb never learned to listen to. If the North excels at anything more than surviving winter, it is holding grudges. Every house, every bloodline has its own pride, and Robb, wearing the crown, handles this powder keg with the confidence of someone who believes loyalty is eternal. Unfortunately, loyalty in wartime behaves like the stock market, fluctuating with emotion and perfectly capable of crashing because of one dumb decision. And that dumb decision arrives fast. So fast, the North doesn't even have time to decide whether to be disappointed or furious. Robb, in a moment, historians later call destiny, and sensible people call pure stupidity, marries Talisa, a woman who is not part of any political deal, treaty, alliance, or strategic hope. No alliance, no diplomatic benefit, no leverage, just love. Beautiful, yes, but utterly inappropriate in a world where every death comes with a political footnote. Robb winning battles won't matter, they whisper in the great halls, because his strongest enemy is his heart. Frey, the man whose marriage contract got tossed aside, is furious in the way an investor rages when a multi-million deal gets canceled at the last minute. And if the Freys hate anything more than disrespect, it is being forgotten. A young king can fight an army, but he cannot fight the petty spite of an old man who counts every benefit in every arrangement. While Robb is floating in his private little cloud of happiness, cracks begin spreading through the Northern Alliance like cold water seeping into stone walls. House Karstark, a major military pillar, is furious. because Robb refuses to execute the man who killed their 2 sons in the Northern Way, which means immediate decapitation. Robb wants to uphold the law. Karstark wants blood. And in Westeros, justice rarely sides with the man who wants to follow the rules. In a dim room, Karstark looks at Robb and sees a young man standing at the crossroads of duty and honor. Robb looks at Karstark and sees a shadow of his father, Ned Stark, a man who once did the right thing at the worst possible time. One moment of hesitation, and Robb repeats history in the most literal way. He executes his closest supporter, believing that this protects the honor of the entire kingdom. Among the murmuring soldiers, someone mutters, "To be king, Robb needs an army. To lose an army, Robb needs a wife." There are leadership lessons you only learn when it's too late. Robb is completing the entire curriculum in one short campaign season. Every mistake looks like an ally walking away. Every decision made from the heart is another cut at the fragile base of his newly built throne. But the deepest pain lies elsewhere. Robb is a king loved by his soldiers, but a king who is loved is not always a king who is listened to. Robb inspires on the battlefield, but at the negotiating table, he is just a young man who believes too much in kindness, a quality that simply does not exist in politics. Frey looks at Robb like he's staring at a defective product being aggressively oversold. Walder Frey, people say bitterly, can forgive anything except one thing, that he is old and being forgotten. And Robb, with all the romantic optimism of youth, reminds him of that in the most painful way. And yet, amid the political chaos, there is one thing about Robb that people cannot truly hate. He genuinely believes he is doing what's right. He does not intend betrayal, no scheming, no elaborate plots, just a sincere desire to build a just kingdom, the same dream his father once carried. But Westeros is not a world of justice. It is a world of wounds and debts, and a king who cannot manage debt, whether blood debt or emotional debt, is like a man holding a sword but forgetting to oil it. When action is needed, everything jams. Robb enters the war as a hero, but he is slipping slowly into the role of a tragedy. He looks at the map and still sees a path to victory. But that path, like every survival path in history, is not only painted red with enemies' blood, but gray with the disappointment of allies who are drifting away. In a quiet moment inside the war tent, Talisa places a hand on Robb's back and softly asks, "Are you all right?" Robb smiles, a beautiful smile, young, tender, and naive enough that even history blushes and looks away. Because history already knows what Robb does not. A good heart is not enough to survive a world built on betrayal. And in that dim light, the fate of Robb Stark, the young king in the north, begins to tilt, not because of a sword, not because of defeat, but because of a series of small decisions, each wrong at precisely the wrong time. Robb's tragedy isn't that he chose the wrong wife. It's that he chose the right love in the wrong world. If in the north people fight with swords and feelings, then in King's Landing, the preferred weapon of choice is rumor. This city runs not on battle drums, but on whispers. No armies needed, no magic required, just one rumor blown in the right direction, and the entire kingdom can fall apart before lunchtime. After Blackwater, King's Landing does not fall silent to honor the dead. It is loud, the smug noise of people who survived without knowing whether they survived by luck, or because someone else did all the hard work for them. Cups of wine are raised to celebrate victory, but no one mentions the person who actually sent that wildfire bolt straight into Stannis' face. Legends are rewritten, and this time, the author is the crown itself. At the center of all that bustle stands Tywin Lannister, a man who can enter a room and change the color of the air. He doesn't raise a cup, doesn't smile, doesn't need cheering. Tywin simply arrives, and his presence alone rearranges everyone's priorities. People like to say wars are won by those who carry swords, but in King's Landing, wars are won by those who carry a ledger. Tywin surveys the realm not with a general's gaze, but with the cold evaluation of an auditor, identifying who deserves to exist and who should be cut from the budget. Tywin doesn't need to fight, a court whisperer says. He just needs to decide who gets axed. And truly, the court runs like a quietly bankrupt company. Keep the useful assets, dispose of the liabilities, and absolutely never let emotion interfere. Tywin has no time for feelings. He is busy rebuilding an order he believes only he understands. Tyrion, on the other hand, understands emotion all too well, but he finds his power stripped away at the exact moment he believes he deserves recognition. The hero of Blackwater, the man who saved the city with sheer strategy, is now assigned to manage the kingdom's finances, a position whose previous occupants tend to end up in exactly two places: a prison or a grave. Tyrion's named Master of Coin, the narrator might snicker, because the last guy is dead and the next guy has not been born. While Tywin restructures power, Joffrey is busy restructuring. Everyone's fear of him. No one knows how the young king will react to anything. Power in Joffrey's hands is like handing a matchstick to a child sitting in a hay barn. Everyone is terrified, but no one dares intervene. Joffrey doesn't rule by law, he rules with mood swings. Today, he kills a minstrel because the song annoyed him. Tomorrow, he might demand someone's head for living. Too close. A kingdom cannot survive on 5-second emotions, yet King's Landing runs exactly on that principle. In King's Landing, people whisper, laws exist to justify the mistakes of the powerful. In this chaotic mosaic, Sansa Stark, the girl who once dreamed of royal life, is now a prisoner in a palace covered in gold. No chains, no dungeon, only the eyes that dissect her and the smiles that taste like poison. King's Landing tortures in a special way. It lets you live, but never lets you be free. Each day, Sansa walks through the Great Hall like a temporary ornament. Everyone sees her as a political opportunity, but no one sees her as a person. Caught in a web of fake promises, Sansa begins to understand that King's Landing is not the city of schemes. It is the city of weaponized expectations. In another corner, Margaery Tyrell, a southern rose, has begun doing what all flowers know best, blooming at the right moment. She watches Joffrey the way a naturalist studies a dangerous predator, from afar, carefully, with quiet calculation. No one says it aloud, but everyone knows. Margaery has ambition, soft as silk, but sharp as a hidden blade behind her smile. Amid these silent power adjustments, Tyrion is the only one who steps back far enough to see the whole picture. He understands what his father wants, how dangerous Joffrey is, and how calculated Margaery's moves are. But what Tyrion cannot understand is why the smartest people in this city are always the ones who suffer most. Perhaps the answer lies in an old truth. King's Landing is not built on stone, it is built on fear. And whoever controls fear rules. It is no coincidence that this city survives on rumor. Rumors travel fast, slip through stone walls, cross social classes, and turn any tale into truth, if repeated enough times. One whisper that Tyrion is plotting treason could destroy him. One story that Sansa is disloyal could ruin her forever. King's Landing doesn't need demons. It has its people. Outside the wall, Sam runs for his life. Here, everyone runs to keep their masks intact. And the most dangerous part is they don't even realize they're running. Because in King's Landing, no one truly wins. People simply manage to delay losing longer than others. And as night falls over the capital, only one question remains. Who will be the first to pay the price for a victory they never truly earned? There are people in history who do not die because of enemies, nor because of war, but because of the distorted version of themselves they try so desperately to become. Theon Greyjoy is one of them. A man who spent his life trying to prove he belonged somewhere, only to finally realize nowhere truly wanted him. After betraying the Starks and taking Winterfell, the one achievement history ever bothers to record for him, Theon thought he had become a great warrior. But any triumph built on delusion will eventually collapse under the weight of reality. And Theon's reality arrived in the form of a man he didn't even know on the first day. Ramsay Snow. In Theon's imagination, the Ironborn were wild, fierce, free. But in the eyes of the North, the Ironborn were just armored pirates, loud, impulsive, and easily manipulated by a well-placed compliment. Theon was worse, an Ironborn raised like a Stark, wrapped in luxury and warmth, yet dreaming of becoming a kind of man he did not even understand. The Ironborn live by the motto, "We do not sow," but Theon was determined to sow mistakes. Theon wanted loyalty, but loyalty must be built on trust, not occupation. Theon wanted respect, but respect must be earned through action, not shouting at soldiers. Theon wanted to feel important, but he chose the worst possible way to achieve it, betraying the only family that had ever loved him. But even betrayal has rules. And Theon, blinded by pride, never bothered to read the fine print. Winterfell did not belong to him. It belonged to the silence of snow, to the memory of the Starks, and to the cold stares the North reserves for anyone foolish enough to crown himself king. When Ramsay appeared, Theon saw an ally. The audience, meanwhile, saw the next chapter of a tragedy. Ramsay didn't rage, didn't shout, didn't show emotion. He only smiled, the smile of someone who watches prey walk willingly into a trap, and even thanks him for holding the door. The greatest mistake of Theon's life wasn't taking Winterfell. The greatest mistake was trusting a smile like that. Theon lost Winterfell, lost friends, lost family. Ramsay just helped him complete the collection. From that moment on, Theon's downfall came not from outside, but from within. Ramsay didn't need to kill him. He simply peeled him apart, layer by layer, pride, name, memory, dignity. He did it with the patient cruelty of a sculptor, an art beautiful only to the sculptor and agonizing only to the one being carved. The torture chamber was not Theon's real prison. The silence was. Silence when he begged and no one answered. Silence when doing right earned punishment and doing wrong earned punishment too. Silence when every question led to a new consequence. Silence when people called him by a name that was no longer his. Reek. The name began as mockery, then it became a lesson, then a rule. And finally, the most tragic stage, it became the truth. Calling Theon Reek is like calling customer service after your order has already exploded. There's nothing left to claim, but the name remains in the system. Theon fought back, tried to hold himself together, tried to preserve the fragments of the Stark-shaped person he once was. But Ramsay understood something Theon never did. Identity isn't something that clings to you. It's something you cling to in order to survive. And when a person falls into despair, they will cling to anything strong enough to hold them, even a name given through humiliation. Reek. A small, soft sound, as light as breath, yet powerful enough to extinguish everything Theon once believed himself to be. From a different angle, Theon's tragedy isn't that he lost his freedom. His tragedy is that he lost his own story. Theon once imagined himself the hero of his life, fighting, returning home, reclaiming his rightful place. But Ramsay peeled away every layer of that fantasy like peeling an onion. And with every layer, there was a tear. In the flickering firelight of the retaken Winterfell, Ramsay speaks to Theon in a voice both gentle and horrifying. You are Reek. You have always been Reek, and Reek is not allowed to think. No blades needed. Just a sentence repeated long enough, deep enough, at the right moments, and a person will believe it. That is what makes Ramsay's torture more terrifying than any weapon. He wasn't trying to kill Theon. He was trying to convince Theon that death wasn't necessary, because nothing inside him was worth dying for. But in all that darkness, Westeros continues spinning. War rages on. Kings still fight for scraps of land. No one asks where Theon is. No one asks if he's alive. Even those who hated him have stopped thinking about him. Forgetfulness becomes the deadliest blow. Theon slips out of the world like a misplaced gust of wind and returns as a trembling shadow afraid of every sound. The tragedy of Theon is not that Ramsay took a part of his body. The tragedy is that Theon delivered the rest of himself into Ramsay's hands. And the question history poses to us is not, did Theon deserve this? But rather, how many of us have destroyed our own identities just to be accepted by someone? There are moments in a person's life that arrive without warning, yet when they strike, they tear apart every protective layer we've built around ourselves. Jaime Lannister, once the greatest swordsman in Westeros, a man who lived on glory and rumor, experienced one of those moments, so brief that if you blink, you miss it. But Jaime didn't miss it. He lived every second of that collapse. Up until his capture, Jaime was a legend that was honestly a little ridiculous. A man so handsome that anything he said became truth, a swordsman so skilled that any battlefield defeat was blamed on circumstances. Jaime walked through life as though the structure of the world itself existed to favor him. No need to ask for permission. The doors opened on their own. No need to prove anything. The stories built around him did that for him. But legends have one fatal flaw. They cannot survive reality. And reality has a habit of throwing ice-cold water at you right when you're convinced you're invincible. When captured by the rough Bolton men, Jaime still carried that familiar arrogance. He spoke as if everything was only temporary. He wore his pride like invisible armor, believing that even chained, dragged through mud, he was still Jaime Lannister, the man the whole kingdom whispered about, hated, envied, admired. But there was one truth he hadn't learned yet. The Boltons don't care about legends. They care about entertainment. The first crack in Jaime's pride came when he tried to negotiate using his reputation and received nothing but mocking laughter. But pride wasn't Jaime's sword arm. It was only the introduction. Jaime's right hand, literally, was the thing that built everything. His fame, his power, his respect. It was the hand that wielded the sword which wrote his bright, bloody chapter in Westerosi history. It was the engine of every rumor told about the Kingslayer. It was the core of his identity. And it was cut off in a single stroke. No warning, no threat, no countdown. Just a clean, dry sound, like a brittle branch snapping. In that moment, Jaime's world didn't explode. It didn't collapse in panic. It simply went silent, as if the entire universe paused just to make him look at the empty space where a part of himself used to be. A silence so painful, no one dared speak into it. Jaime had once been the greatest swordsman. Now he was a minimalist version. After that cut, two Jaimes existed at the same time. The Jaime before he lost his hand, and the Jaime after. The first was a product of legend. The second, raw, trembling, furious, confused, was the real man. The transition from legend to human is a brutal process. Before, when Jaime spoke, people listened. Now, when he speaks, people laugh. Before, when he commanded, they obeyed. Now, when he asks for water, they throw it in his face. The world hasn't changed. Only Jaime, and how he sees the world, has changed beyond recognition. But in that collapse, something strange begins to awaken. Jaime's honor, the thing he spent a lifetime pretending he didn't have. The first person to notice it is Brienne. Brienne of Tarth, a woman mocked by every prejudice in the realm, is the only one who sees Jaime not as the Kingslayer, but as a man wrestling with the truth. And she does not leave him, even when every reason to stay disappeared along with his hand. Dragged through wastelands, imprisoned, insulted, tested with the cruelest amusements, Brienne never bows. And Jaime, for the first time in his life, finds himself unable to keep wearing that familiar smirk of contempt. In the darkness, as Jaime burns with fever, Brienne whispers, "You're not as bad as you think you are, Jaime." No one had ever said that to him. No one had ever seen him that way. Jaime's entire life had been compressed into one act, killing a king, an act no one ever asked him to explain. Because Westeros doesn't care about motives, it only cares about labels. And Brienne, a woman incapable of flattery, becomes the first person to ask the question the whole realm avoided. Why did you do it? Jaime's answer is not a plea for absolution. It feels like the confession of a soul realizing it has been silent far too long in the story of its own life. Jaime saved King's Landing from Aerys's wildfire. He saved tens of thousands of people. But glory never came, only scorn. And he accepted it. Accepted being seen as a villain because no one wanted the truth he carried. But now, with no hand to wield a sword, no reputation to lean on, no legend to hide behind, Jaime finally speaks, not to be forgiven, but to be seen. One hand gone in exchange for a man found. That's the best deal Jaime ever made. And in the moment he leaps into the bear pit to save Brienne, wounded, weak, stripped of all legendary shine, Jaime's true self emerges more clearly than ever. He doesn't save her for honor. He saves her because it is the right thing to do, a decision born not from pride, but from the heart. In a world where everyone runs from the truth, Jaime's willingness to face himself, without his hand, without his sword, without his myth, is the smallest, most meaningful victory he has ever earned. Brienne may have saved Jaime's life, but Jaime, in that final moment inside the bear pit, saved whatever remained of his soul. The name Kingslayer does not disappear. But from this point on, it no longer stands as a venomous legend repeated by others. It becomes a scar, proof of a man who stepped out of his own myth to become real. A man who once carried pride in his hand, now learns to bow with his heart. There are moments in history that aren't called battles, nor treaties, nor reigns. They're called transactions. And sometimes a transaction can shake an empire far more violently than any massacre. Daenerys Targaryen, the young exiled girl walking through the desert with 3 baby dragons, made one such transaction in Astapor, a city where the value of a human life is measured in money, and the value of money is measured in suffering. Astapor is the furnace of the slave world, a place where children are stripped of identity and forged into perfect soldiers. No heart, no emotion, no questions. They call them the unsullied, souls so clean that it's terrifying because they're clean only after everything that could stain human dignity has been removed. Daenerys, delicate as a seashell on the outside, marched right into the heart of that brutal economy with a plan that can only be described as 3 words: absolutely, terrifyingly bold. Before negotiating, she watched thousands of Unsullied stand under the burning sun like living stone statues. No movement, no blinking, no expression, a flawless army. Flawless because they were no longer human. Most people would be horrified. Idiots would be excited. Daenerys smiled. The smile of someone who understands that to break a system, sometimes you have to walk into it pretending to be its ideal customer. Slavemaster Krasny saw Dany as a decorative toy that could walk. He called her little girl, called Jorah her old dog, and called her dragons overgrown lizards with an attitude. From everything he said, we reach one simple conclusion. He holds a master's degree in misjudgment. When Dany said she wanted all the Unsullied, not a few hundred, all of them, the whole city chuckled internally. A young girl with no army, no land, no kingdom, trying to buy the greatest army in the world. That story sounded like a beggar demanding to purchase a castle. But Astapor's mistake was never Daenerys. The mistake was the dragons. They wanted Drogon, the flying, fire-breathing monster capable of making grown men tremble at a shadow. And Daenerys, with a voice soft as sea wind, said she was willing to trade him for the army. There are many kinds of silence in the world, but the silence that follows a girl calmly selling her only dragon, that is a special kind, the silence of a storm laughing quietly before tearing everything apart. Dracarys, Daenerys' way of saying contract invalid in attorney language. The deal was sealed. Drogon handed the slaver. The whip that commands the Unsullied was handed to Daenerys. Both sides smiled. Astapor smiled because they believed they had fooled their prey. Daenerys smiled because they really believed that. Then came the most important moment of Daenerys' entire life. Not when the dragons hatched, not when she walked through fire unburned, but when she accepted the whip, turned her back and spoke in High Valyrian, the language Kraznys assumed she didn't understand. Unsullied, kill your masters. In that instant, history switched gears. No drums, no long commands, just thousands of former slaves lifting their heads and stepping toward the men who forged them out of brutality. Blades rose, blood soaked the sunset, and then the three legendary syllables, Dracarys. Fire erupted like the breath of an ancient god. Drogon burned Kraznys to ash, and the city cracked under the heat of vengeance. Daenerys stood still, face unreadable, as if watching something obvious unfold. Evil, when empowered for too long, inevitably engineers its own death. Astapor's masters never understood. The most frightening thing was not the dragon. It was the person raising it. After the city's collapse, Daenerys turned to her new army. They were silent, upright, waiting. But instead of wielding the whip, Dany dropped it. "You are free," she said. "If you wish to leave, leave. If you wish to fight beside me, I will not use you as tools." The army did not move. No one fled. No one took their eyes off her. One soldier struck his spear against his shield, a single sound like a vow. Then 1,000 others followed. The city shook, not from war, but from the moment men who had been turned into objects were given back their humanity. Daenerys Targaryen did not simply purchase an army, she redeemed their souls. This was not a win-win deal. It was a win-ash deal. In the twilight, as the wind swept through the ruins of Astapor, Daenerys stood before the army she had freed and understood something most rulers never grasp. Power doesn't come from the fear others have of you. Power comes from the trust they willingly place in you. Astapor misjudged her because they saw only 3 dragons. They did not see the resolve forged through a forced marriage. They did not see the unbreakable will hardened by the desert. They did not see the quiet fire of Targaryen blood burning beneath her calm. A weak person could not have done what Daenerys did, but a cruel person couldn't have done it either. Only someone who understands both the worth of freedom and the heartbreak of losing it can free others without becoming a new tyrant. And as she turned, leading thousands of unsullied footsteps behind her, history smiled, because it knew a storm had just been born. Among all the military institutions in Westeros, the Night's Watch is perhaps the only one where men swear lifelong loyalty in the dark, only to wake up the next morning and forget what they swore. Not because they aren't serious, but because life on the wall is harsh enough to grind down ideals faster than wind and snow grind down stone. The Night's Watch was founded to defend humanity from the darkness in the north. But after thousands of years, the darkness is still there. Only the ideals of men have died. And when ideals die before the soldiers do, the institution twists into a warped version of itself, a semi-military prison that recruits criminals and those with nowhere left to go. And yet, strangely enough, when chaos erupts, people still expect the Night's Watch to stand firm like its ancient walls. But stone doesn't betray you. People do, with remarkable consistency. After the attack from the north, the surviving brothers of the Night's Watch returned to Castle Black looking like walking ghosts, starving, freezing, panicked, and so hopeless that they'd run out of hopelessness. Sam wheezed like a torn bellows. Gren rambled like he was telling a ghost story to himself. Pip tried to smile just so he wouldn't cry. There was nothing noble left in this force once hailed as mankind's last shield. Night's Watch, where the oath is longer than the list of survivors. That single sentence perfectly captures the institution's state. They vowed to defend the realm until their last breath, but that last breath always comes before they manage to defend anything. They swear not to take wives or father children, but nobody swore they wouldn't die pointlessly. The only thing they can cling to is the wall, which, ironically, is the only thing that never compliments them. In the cold room of Commander Mormont, the survivors stood in a misshapen circle, each wearing a different shade of despair. The old bear struggled to keep his voice steady, to uphold the authority of a commander, but even his tone trembled before the memory of the White Walkers. No one believed the South would help them. King's Landing had its own problems. The North was drowning in war. The Riverlands had burned. The only trustworthy place left was this one. Castle Black, the fortress of the forgotten. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't grand. It wasn't legendary. But at least it didn't betray anyone, except the very people living in it. One night when the wind wailed like torn spirits, Sam sat in a corner and thought about the only time he ever did something right, stabbing a White Walker. And even that moment came from panic rather than bravery. Sam didn't kill a White Walker, the narrator might whisper. He just stabbed at the right time. That is both the weakness and the strength of the Night's Watch. They have no heroes. They only have men who make countless mistakes and occasionally, by outrageous accident, do one thing correctly. And sometimes, one correct thing is enough to save the world. But before saving the world, the Night's Watch had to fix a simpler problem. Themselves. No one wanted to take orders. No one wanted to follow the rules. Some abandoned their posts. Some stole food. Others fled. A few began whispering about rebellion. In that chaos, Mormont realized he wasn't commanding an army. He was commanding a pack of starving wolves, some of which had forgotten the difference between comrade and meat. The crisis erupted in the kitchen, as do many of the worst rebellions in history. Except this one began with a pot. One scrawny brother, desperate, starving, eyes sunken deep, reacted to an order with a rusty knife. And a rusty knife, when driven far enough, can still kill the best man in the room. Mormont fell to the very men he protected, not in battle, not under the blade of a White Walker, but under the hands of men he had sheltered. Is there anything more darkly comedic than a military order collapsing over dinner? They didn't kill Mormont for betrayal. They killed him out of hunger, fear, and the complete loss of belief. And when an institution loses faith in its leader, it doesn't need an external enemy to crumble. It devours itself. After the old bear's death, the Night's Watch became an army with no commander, no rules, no hope. A shivering cluster of survivors hiding behind a massive wall of ice, trying to convince themselves everything would be fine if they just pretended nothing was broken. But some failures cannot be ignored. Some cracks cannot be plastered over with orders. Some nights cannot be survived with oaths alone. And as the northern wind grew stronger, carrying the invisible cries of something ancient drawing near, the Night's Watch understood that they had only one choice left: stand firm or melt. The frightening truth was that many of them had melted long ago, and only the Black Cloak remained to remind them who they used to be. Amid all that chaos, Sam still survived, not because of skill, but because of a strange kind of luck, as if the world kept refusing to choose him as its victim. He looked at Castle Black, the cracked walls, the rotting beams, the collapsing morale, and realized something that men far above him would never admit. The Night's Watch didn't fall because the enemy was strong. It fell because its protectors were weak. And when ideals die before the men who swore them, even the oath cannot hold them up anymore. Only one question remains, suspended in the freezing wind. If the Night's Watch, humanity's last shield, has already rotted from within, then who will stand when the darkness returns? If war shakes Westeros with swords and spears, then debt quietly digs the holes that the whole kingdom falls into without even having time to scream. And no one understands this better than Tyrion Lannister, a man who rode from the triumph of Blackwater straight into the basement of reality in a single morning. Every legend about his victory was swallowed whole by King's Landing like a starving beast. The face of triumph wasn't Tyrion, it was Tywin, who arrived just in time to claim the glory others bled for. Life can be simple. Whoever rides the prettiest horse gets photographed as the winner. But irony always lurks nearby. As a reward for saving the city, Tyrion was given a position that sounded prestigious: Master of Coin, the treasurer of the entire kingdom. A grand title, heavy, glittering mostly because it was on the verge of exploding. The men who had held the job before him were either dead or had vanished into the shadows, leaving behind an invisible note Tyrion could read the moment he opened the first ledger. Run while you still can. But Tyrion didn't run. He sat down, flipped through the pages, and immediately understood why Littlefinger always smiled. When you're the only one who knows the kingdom's finances are so empty they could double as festival drums, you have plenty of reasons to smirk mysteriously. King's Landing's economy has only 2 states, broken and about to break. And tragically, the Treasury was currently in a 3rd state, broken long ago, but everyone is pretending it's fine. Tyrion read through the mountain of loans, the Iron Bank of Bravos, House Tyrell, House Lannister, merchants from every port, and expenses so bizarre even he couldn't figure out why they existed. Joffrey's extravagant feasts, Tywin's troop deployments, castle repairs, and the massive budget for the city watch, all recorded as though the writer believed money could appear through sheer willpower. Tyrion closed the ledger and sighed. Tyrion was given the job of Master of Coin, the narrator might whisper, because his predecessor managed to run straight into the grave. In that cramped office, buried in books, Tyrion recognized a truth no one in the court dared to say. The entire kingdom was running on promises, not gold, and promises, when accumulated long enough, become a kind of debt more toxic than Bravosi interest rates. Littlefinger, who once held this post, had transformed the treasury into a maze where every number led to the same foggy wall. Don't ask. That wasn't accounting. That was sorcery. And Tyrion, clever as he was just a spectator arriving after the magic show ended, staring at the smoke left on the stage. The situation worsened when Tywin, with the air of a man who never cares where money comes from, kept demanding funds for war. Joffrey spent money the way he spent oxygen, easily, thoughtlessly, and with absolutely no permission needed. At one feast, when Tyrion quietly reminded Joffrey that the treasury was struggling, the young king looked up with genuine shock. The treasury? Doesn't it refill itself? That was the moment Tyrion realized the most dangerous places in Westeros were not the battlefields, but the rooms where decisions were made. There are 2 things no one can trace in Westeros: Joffrey's real father and the kingdom's real balance sheet. While juggling numbers, Tyrion also had to face something even scarier than debt: Margaery Tyrell. Not because she was dangerous, but because she understood how dangerous others were. Where the Lannisters ruled through fear, the Tyrells ruled through affection. The combination produced something commoners called graceful politics, and intelligent people called a new power structure. Tyrion watched Margaery guiding Sansa, speaking sweetly to the poor, smiling at Joffrey like he was a normal human being. And he realized, this girl understands power better than half the old men on the council. A woman like that, in a city like this, was not just a future queen. She was a warning. And the warning applied to Tyrion as well. Standing before his financial desk, Tyrion didn't see numbers. He saw political traps, a prestigious position filled with hidden knives, a kingdom drowning in debt, a young king who understood nothing beyond cruelty, and a father who viewed Tyrion as a failed investment. And in a rare moment without wine, Tyrion wondered, in all my sins, is there one greater than trying to save a kingdom that doesn't want to be saved? That is his tragedy. Tyrion sees the truth, and in King's Landing, truth is something that always gets punished. That night, as he closed the ledgers, Tyrion sat in silence and contemplated the absurdity of power. An empire may have armies, gold, weapons, and still collapse because of one simple thing, a number no one wants to look at. Debt is history's dark comedy. It teaches that every victory has a bill, and the bill always arrives at the worst possible moment. King's Landing, with its lavish feasts and bloody politics, was running on borrowed coins, a magnificent palace built on a swamp. The more you decorate it, the deeper it sinks. And Tyrion, standing on the balcony overlooking the city, understood better than anyone. This kingdom won't break because of war. It will break because no one dares open the books. In the storm-torn world of Westeros, where every relationship is governed by bloodlines, vows, honor, and rusted political machinery, love is a luxury so rare that people only dare to dream of it, never to keep it. And in the frozen wilds, where even the sun seems hesitant to rise, Jon Snow found that luxury in the shape of a red-haired girl, Ygritte. Their love was not romantic. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't the kind of story minstrels would sing in great halls. It existed like a dance in a blizzard, beautiful, dangerous, and one gust away from disappearing forever. They both knew this. And still, they stepped into it, like two people with nothing left to lose. From the first moment Ygritte looked at Jon with that half-teasing, half-testing gaze, their relationship was defined not by words, but by the small space between the heart and the truth. Jon was pretending to be a traitor. Ygritte knew he was lying. Jon knew she knew. And she knew he knew she knew, a strange little circle of distorted honesty. Ygritte didn't love Jon because he was smart. She loved him because she'd met men worse than him. That sentence, if the storyteller allows a little sarcasm, isn't just a joke. It explains something Jon had never experienced, being seen, being touched, being valued not for his bloodline, but for his stance and his clumsy sincerity. Was it love? Maybe not yet. But curiosity? Absolutely. Among the Wildlings, there are no fixed rules, no noble traditions, no walls built from ancestral expectations. There is snow, wind, and the brutal honesty of people who have nothing to hide behind except fur. Jon Snow, the unacknowledged son of House Stark, entered a world where he was not defined by the word bastard. The only question that mattered was, which side are you on? Not an easy question, but at least not a fake one. And Ygritte, whose laughter sparked like a small flame in the winter night, challenged him more deeply than anyone from the Night's Watch ever had. Their love could climb the wall, but it couldn't climb over two opposing ideologies. A truth painful enough to sting. Their romance truly began in the cave, a temporary sanctuary for two people running from the roles they were supposed to play. Warm water dripping like gentle mist, Firelight flickering against stone, nothing remained except breath, skin, and a warmth Jon didn't realize he had been starving for. In that cave, there was no night's watch, no wildlings, no war, no vows, just two human beings touching freedom for the first time. "Don't ever betray me," Ygritte whispered, soft but sharp as an unshot arrow. If love is a promise wrapped in expectation, then Ygritte spoke that expectation with the gentleness of a breeze and the blade of absolute demand. Jon, being who he was, couldn't lie in a moment like that. He looked into her eyes and believed he could keep that promise, believed that love could soften every boundary. But love isn't strong enough to erase. Politics, not strong enough to dissolve oaths carved into bone, not strong enough to make Jon Snow abandon who he is. What Ygritte loved most about Jon Snow was the thing that would break her heart, his loyalty. And what Jon loved about Ygritte was the one thing he could never have, her freedom. They loved one another with qualities that completely contradicted each other. One bound to duty, one believes only in a world without chains. That clash didn't create harmony. It created cracks, small at first, then widening with every step they took together. During the climb up the wall, wind whipping like whips, ice falling like it wanted to crush them, Jon saw Ygritte's strength surpass any soldier he had ever known. But the moment they reached the summit, looking out at the world spread below like a living map, Jon understood their love did not stand on the same side. On one side was the order he had sworn to protect. On the other hand was the girl who believed in freedom so fiercely she could not accept even one small lie. And he was lying, not to her, to himself. Love is always most beautiful right before it breaks. And they're shattered in silence. No screaming, no accusations, just a moment when Ygritte looked at Jon with eyes that asked questions he could never answer. She did not ask why he had to go. She did not ask why he betrayed her. She did not ask why the promise in the cave wasn't enough to keep him. She just looked. And in that gaze, Jon saw his sentence. Ygritte understood Jon better than Jon understood Jon. And because of that, she knew he would leave her to return to the Night's Watch. He had to leave. She had to hurt. There was no right choice, only an unavoidable one. Jon Snow knows everything, except how to keep the woman he loves. That sentence, half sympathy, half accusation, half wry laughter, sums up his entire journey. Jon never learned to love without guilt, and Ygritte never learned to trust without absolutes. In a world of war and politics, love isn't medicine. It's a brief, beautiful pause before reality crushes everything again. But that pause, fragile, fleeting, a single breath in a snowstorm, was worth more than every oath Jon ever spoke. Because it reminded him, and us, of a bitter truth. Not every love is born to survive. But some loves are born to make us grow, and Jon Snow, in the end, did grow, at a price paid directly by the heart. If anyone wants to understand what it means for two utterly opposite people to illuminate one another, they need only look at Jaime Lannister and Brienne of Tarth trudging through the mud after leaving Harrenhal. There are no ballads about them, no septon blesses their journey. But there is something strange and undeniable that exists between these two souls who should never have shared the same story. Truth, the one thing everyone in Westeros fears to touch. Brienne, in the eyes of the world, is a paradox, too strong to be considered a woman, too honest to be considered a knight, and too righteous to survive long in Westeros. People mock her for her rough exterior, her unpolished voice, her loyalty forged like steel. But if Westeros is a mirror, Brienne is the reflection of what everyone secretly fears, living by the principles they only dare to mention in their vows. Jaime, on the other hand, is everything Brienne never wants to become. Beautiful, arrogant, wasted, and cursed by a reputation he both hates and depends on. Kingslayer, the king's killer. Those two words stalk him like a ghost, suffocating every attempt at decency, drowning whatever good he's ever done. And Jaime never tried to fix it. He let the world decide who he was and lived down to their lowest expectations. Two people like that would never meet in any other story. But in the tragedy of war, they become mirrors for each other, reflecting what the other lacks, what the other must learn, and what both believed they had lost. When Jaime lost his hand, the one symbol of his skill, his honor, his identity, Brienne was the first to see him not as the Golden Prince whispered about in legend, but as a broken man, stripped bare of every defense, a version of Jaime who could no longer hide behind beauty or swagger. No one thought Jaime would come back for Brienne, not even Jaime. That is the truest part of their story. Every good thing Jaime does beside Brienne is something he never imagined himself capable of. And in that journey, he discovers what his sword had always hidden from him, a conscience. On the road, they are tormented by Bolton men who treat cruelty as entertainment. Their jeers toward Brienne, vicious, crude, dripping with contempt, make Jaime see something he had never bothered to notice: the brutality of men when confronted with something they cannot understand. And Brienne, instead of bowing her head, stands tall, a living shield. That stance irritates Jaime, not because it's wrong, but because it's right in a way he no longer has the courage to emulate. In Westeros, honor is a decoration people love to display but rarely practice. Brienne practices it so earnestly that she becomes a joke. Jaime buries it so deeply that it becomes a shameful secret. One lives too truthfully, the other too falsely, and that makes them perfect lessons for each other. The bear pit, the moment that redefines them, is not a birthplace of heroes. It is the place where truth is forced to step out of hiding. Brienne is thrown into the pit with no armor, no sword, only a rotting stick. A massive bear roars in front of her, like fate screaming at anyone too honest to live long in Westeros. The Bolton soldiers watch, laughing as if this were a theater, and Jaime, still weak, still wounded, walks into the pit like a man who no longer expects to survive the day. The bear wasn't the frightening thing. The truth Jaime had to face was, he didn't go there to save her. He went there to save the part of himself he had let die long ago. The moment Jaime jumps, no sword, no right hand, no plan, is the moment he confronts the fear that has defined him his whole life: being misjudged, misunderstood, mislabeled. He is no longer running from Kingslayer. He is fighting back, if only this once, to prove that the name does not contain the whole story. Brienne looks at Jaime, not with the weakness of someone being rescued, but with the respect of someone witnessing a soul rising from the ashes of its own honor. In that instant, they become allies, not in war, but in truth. After the bear pit, Jaime and Brienne sit in the dark, saying nothing, not even looking at each other. But silence can be the deepest form of communication. And in that silence, Jaime understands that Brienne never saw him as the Kingslayer. She saw him as a man carrying the weight of a righteous act misunderstood by the entire world. One bear pit scene did more for Jaime's reputation than 20 years of PR. Exactly. Not an excuse, not whine, not rumors, just one action. A moment without glory, without music, without audience, when the most infamous man in Westeros stopped acting the villain everyone demanded he be. In Brienne's eyes, Jaime finds what he has never found anywhere else: unconditional trust. And in Jaime's eyes, Brienne finds something no knight had ever given her: recognition from someone who finally understands what honor truly means. If Jon and Ygritte's love was a beautiful wound, then the bond between Jaime and Brienne is a scar, long, painful, but steadfast. A scar that reminds us some truths can only be born from ruin. From this moment on, Jaime is no longer the Kingslayer in his own mind, which matters more than whether the world believes it. And Brienne, the woman mocked by the entire realm, carries with her the story of a Heim no one else ever saw and no one else ever had the patience to look for. In a world full of betrayal, these two opposites found each other, not to rewrite history, but to remind history that sometimes the most beautiful thing is not victory, but the moment someone chooses what is right, even if they have to face a bear to do it. History is usually written in blood, but every now and then, it's written in PR campaigns. And when it comes to the art of fighting a war while also building a brand, no one in Westeros or Essos does it more effectively than Daenerys Targaryen, who, right after liberating Astapor, immediately turned her gaze toward Yunkai like a marketing strategist scouting her next expansion market. Yunkai is not the strongest city, nor the richest, but it has one thing slave traders value above all: reputation. The city of gold, where the masters pride themselves on the sophistication of their exploitation, not brutish like Astapor, not yet monstrous like Meereen. In Yunkai, oppression is performed with gentle manners and tidy ledgers, a polite variation of evil. Daenerys sees through it, and what makes her dangerous is not only her dragons, but her ability to read the power structures beneath all that gold leaf. If Astapor was a perfect plot twist, then Yunkai is a full-scale expansion campaign, and Dany behaves exactly like the CEO of a liberation movement entering a phase of explosive growth. When Dany's forces approached Yunkai, she didn't smash the gates, no fire, no dramatic ultimatum. She sent a different message, one designed to travel by whisper. I am not here to take your city. I am here to give it another future. That message wasn't aimed at the masters. It was aimed at the slaves within hundreds of miles. They heard it in market stalls, in kitchens, in their masters' bedrooms. Dany wasn't attacking Yunkai's walls. She was attacking its rumor distribution network. A very clever strategy. And also, very Targaryen. The Yunkish tried offering gold. Dany refused. They tried threatening her with their prestige. Dany laughed. They tried warning her that the city had hired the Second Sons. Dany saw that as a recruitment opportunity. The Second Sons, a sellsword company soaked in wine, in opium smoke, and in men who believe the most dangerous thing in the world, is a woman who knows exactly what she wants. They were hired to defend Yunkai with loyalty, purchased by the day. But when Marrow, their leader, saw Dany, he realized his first truth. No one pays enough to make him fight dragons. His second truth was worse. No one pays in respect, except this girl. And that's why the Second Sons fractured. Some of them looked at Dany and saw a potential employer. Dario Naharis, handsome like a painting and dangerous like his smile, saw an opportunity to stand beside a legend in the making. And in the moment he beheaded his two comrades to offer his loyalty to her, Dany understood something fundamental. War isn't just about fighting. It's about winning people. The Second Sons followed Dany for two reasons. She's beautiful, and the dragons aren't. It sounds like a joke, but it hits the core of her power, a perfect fusion of symbol and substance. The dragons are a real force. Dany, with eyes that cut through lies, is real symbolism. Together, they formed something Yunkai was never prepared to face. The battle didn't last long. When the Unsullied marched, they did what they always do: silent, precise, unstoppable. Opposing them were Yunkai's hired soldiers, men paid to fight, but never paid enough to believe in what they protected. A city built on gold cannot stand against an army built on faith. Faith in freedom, faith in Misa, faith in the woman who walked through fire and lived. Within hours, Yunkai's gates opened, not because dragons burned them, but because fear burned away the last bit of will inside every servant of the masters. And when the gates opened, the slaves poured out like water through a broken dam. They didn't scream, they didn't cheer. They stared at Dany, suspicious, frightened, unsure whether freedom was a blessing or another trap. Then one child touched her. One, then two, then dozens, hundreds, thousands. Daenerys was lifted by the very arms that once wore chains. They called her Mahisa, mother. And that was the moment the line between political movement and religious devotion began to blur. Dany didn't just free slaves, she freed them from having to think for themselves. It sounds cruel, but it is frighteningly accurate. Freedom is beautiful, but most dangerous when it arrives too quickly. The slaves didn't know what to do with a future given back to them. They looked at Dany like a goddess, not a queen. And that kind of devotion, raw, desperate, absolute, is the most fertile soil for power to grow. Daenerys Targaryen, who once had nothing but 3 eggs, now had an army, the beginnings of a faith, and a population that viewed her as salvation incarnate. A cold truth history has seen many times. Freedom easily becomes worship, and worship easily becomes authoritarianism. Dany is not authoritarian, but the worship rising around her is taking the shape of a cult, not because she designed it, but because desperate people built it for her. That night, as Yunkai burned with torchlight and Dany stood in the sea of voices chanting her name, Essos understood something. A movement was no longer just a liberation campaign. It had become an ideal. And ideals, once placed upon someone's shoulders, begin demanding things: land, cities, power, and eventually, the Iron Throne. A wave called Daenerys was rising. No one knew where it would carry the world, only that it had begun, and nothing could stop it now. There are people born with the ability to see through every layer of deception in the world, and Stannis Baratheon, unfortunately, is one of them. Unfortunately, because Westeros is not a place built for clarity. Here, truth is not considered a strength but a vulnerability. Anyone who speaks the truth too early or too bluntly is assigned by history to the chapters no one enjoys reading. After the defeat at Blackwater, Stannis did not collapse, but the kingdom behaved as if he had died. His name vanished from political conversations. No ravens carried news from Dragonstone. King Stannis, the only man with a legitimate claim to the Iron Throne, was pushed into the shadows like a typo in the manuscript of history. Dragonstone became the base of a defeated man. But defeat for Stannis is merely a temporary condition. "When reason wins," he once said, "I will win." A sentence scholars nod at, and the powerful laugh at, because nothing is more inconvenient than believing the world listens to reason. On Dragonstone, the air is always as heavy as the volcanic rock from which it was carved. Davos, the last loyal man brave enough to argue with Stannis, looked around and saw the miniature version of a court, a king exhausted, a priestess overflowing with influence, and a cluster of people who stayed only because they lacked a worse place to go. Melisandre, with eyes red as burning coals, walked through the stone halls like she owned every brick. She spoke with the tone of someone who knows the future, even when that future existed only because others believed her. Stannis trusted her, not because he was naive, but because he was desperate. Defeat carved a hollow inside him, just wide enough for a new faith to slip in. The Red God, the only religion that operates like a high-risk investment fund. Melisandre promised victory, promised light, promised kingship. But in return, she claimed things Stannis did not know he was losing: softness, compassion, and sometimes his very sense of self. But Melisandre is only fire, and this castle needs water, not flame. And that water has a name: Davos. Davos Seaworth, the man who once smuggled onions to keep Stannis' army from starving, has now become the last voice of conscience. He has no magic, no noble blood, no talent for war. The only thing he possesses is the ability to speak the truth in a way that hurts Stannis, but does not anger him. Stannis is not wrong, Davos once thought. He just doesn't know how to make people enjoy hearing the truth. That is the tragedy of the king. In this world, people listen to what they want to hear, not what is right. Melisandre promised Stannis that destiny had chosen him. Davos reminded him that destiny does not pay debts and does not feed armies. Stannis stood between these two voices, and like every lonely man, he chose the one that made him feel powerful, not the one that made him better. One day, Melisandre claimed that Gendry's royal blood could help Stannis win. She said it with a dangerous beauty, like fire on a winter night, warm and capable of burning everything. Gendry, the blacksmith boy unaware of his lineage, became a tool in the war between fire and shadow. Davos watched and understood he had to betray Stannis to save the last remaining human part of him. He freed Gendry from Dragonstone, pushing the boy into a small boat under the cover of night. Each splash of water against the hull sounded like destiny knocking at Stannis' door. When Davos returned, he knelt before the king, opening his hands as if opening his heart. "You want fire, your grace, but fire gives us only ashes." Stannis should have killed Davos on the spot. The law demanded it. Ambition demanded it. Melisandre certainly demanded it. But Stannis, the man beneath the crown, did not want to. Instead, he held up the letter from the Night's Watch, a warning about White Walkers and the real threat moving south. In a low, steady voice, he said, "I need someone who knows who the real enemy is. Stand up, Davos." In that moment, Stannis was no longer a puppet of religion, nor the loser of Blackwater, nor the man clinging to visions to soothe his defeat. He returned to being Stannis Baratheon, the only man who could see what all of Westeros refused to confront. The real battle was not political. It was in the north. Davos is the last firewall between Stannis and madness. Not a word of that is wrong. And it's no surprise that after this moment, Stannis made the only decision a decent king would make. Not to reclaim the Iron Throne first, but to save humanity first. But history, with its trademark dark humor, is rarely kind to those who choose what is right over what is convenient. Stannis prepared to march. Melisandre's flames still burned. Davos's faith still held. But the world still preferred sweet lies to bitter truth. And that is why Stannis, though right, remained cornered. Truth-tellers are never celebrated during chaos. They are only remembered after everyone else has finished ruining everything. Stannis Baratheon is not the king the world wants, but he is the king the world needs, simply a bit too early, a bit too blunt, and far too humorless. War lies ahead. And Stannis, with all the unbending resolve of a soul that refuses to yield, marches north, not to take the throne, but to remind the world that sometimes truth can save it, even when no one wants to hear it. Here, some armies enter history through brilliant strategy, through maps covered in arrows, through command meetings that last until everyone faints from exhaustion. And some armies enter history through pure emotion. The Wildlings belong to the second group, the group that believes the best plan is having no plan. And if anyone asks, what's the next step? The answer is always fight. From above, the wildling host looks like a river of chaos. Giants, hunters, archers, highwaymen, warrior women, children running behind adults, all merging into a force that can only be described with one word: unpredictable. In a normal army, soldiers are divided into squads, units, and battalions. The wildlings divide themselves through natural selection. Whoever yells the loudest goes in front. Whoever carries the most jerky earns respect. Whoever talks too much gets punched. Wildlings don't have maps or mid-tier officers, but they do have very strong feelings. A line that sounds like a joke, but it captures their reality perfectly. To the wildlings, war is not a game of intellect. It's a survival reflex, a primal rebellion against the entire southern world that built a wall to shut them out for thousands of years. When Mance Rayder blows his horn to gather them, they don't hear an order. They hear an opportunity. And that opportunity has a name: the South, where there are no White Walkers, where there are pastures, where warmth still exists. A place they believe offers a slim chance of surviving the nightmare winter approaching. Mance Rayder, king beyond the wall, could have become a superb politician in any southern kingdom. He had been a man of the Night's Watch once. He understood discipline, understood the height of the wall, understood the despair of the North. But instead of staying inside that decaying institution, he walked away to build a force no one believed could last beyond one winter. Yet they endured, not united by laws, but by one shared fear: the White Walkers. That is what makes the Wildlings dangerous in a surprisingly logical way. They are not fighting for land, not for honor, not for kings. They are fighting for life. And those who fight for life, not ideals, are usually the hardest to defeat. But even Mance Rayder, a man whose foresight rivals any northern lord, faces one colossal problem. He leads a people who don't like being led. Their strategy is simple: attack. When that fails, attack again. Whenever Mance proposes a plan, his army immediately rewrites it in the dumbest way possible. He wants them to gather. They go hunting. He wants stealth. They light a campfire for dinner. He wants to avoid conflict. They start one. This leaves Jon Snow, undercover traitor, part-time hostage, full-time headache, both impressed and ready to tear his hair out during every strategy meeting. In one rare moment of honesty, Mance sighed. I don't lead them. I just try to stop them from killing each other before we reach the wall. A complaint that is funny, tragic, and painfully accurate all at once. Meanwhile, ahead of the Wildlings stands Castle Black, a fortress too understaffed to function, yet still tall enough to symbolize silence and resistance. The Night's Watch is in chaos. The commander is dead. Mutiny is brewing. Food is scarce. Fear is abundant. And between the two advancing forces, Jon Snow stands like a piece of driftwood between two colliding currents. The Wildlings trust him. Halfway. The Night's Watch will trust him, maybe 1/10. And Jon himself? He barely trusts his own decisions. But that uncertain position allows him to see the truth both sides refuse to admit. This war will have no victor, only survivors. Ygritte still looks at Jon with eyes that are part belief, part suspicion, part love, part fury, and reminds him every day with that line we know so well, and Jon knows too painfully. You know nothing, Jon Snow. In that line lies the wildling truth. Southerners don't understand them, don't understand their fear, don't understand why breaking the wall is not an invasion, but escape from extinction. When Mance Rayder lights the great signal fire, a blaze so massive that the northern night glows like an apocalypse beacon, it is not a declaration of war. It is a cry for help. But the Night's Watch, blinded by pride and desperation, cannot hear it. And the Wildlings, terrified of losing their final chance, cannot articulate it. Mance prepares to march. Tormund swings his axe at invisible enemies just in case something needs chopping. Giants roar, shaking the snow beneath their feet. Ygritte draws her bow, her eyes sharp as unspoken grief. The only thing they lack, a plan. The only thing they have in excess, a commitment to survive at all costs. While the southern lords squabble over the Iron Throne, in this frozen wasteland, the most important war in the world is about to begin. A war neither side truly wants, but both are forced into. To defeat the Night's Watch, the Wildlings only need one thing: the Night's Watch to fall apart on its own. Tragically, that is exactly what's happening, and as the two forces prepare to crash into each other like cold waves in the dark, the only question that matters is not who is right, but who will still be alive to tell this story tomorrow. Of all the power plays in King's Landing, none is crueler than the play that turns a teenage girl into a piece on the bargaining table. And Sansa Stark, the child who once believed in fairy tales, who dreamed of princes and happy endings, is now learning her first lesson in politics. No one cares about the dreams of a Stark girl when what they really want is her bloodline. After all the tragedies she's endured, Sansa still retains one thing: grace. But even that grace, in King's Landing, isn't seen as virtue. It's a resource. The Lannisters look at her, and they don't see a girl. They see the North. They see Winterfell. They see leverage, a tool to secure a throne through marriage contracts. In Westeros, nothing is easier to negotiate than someone who isn't permitted to say no. On one bright morning, sunlight being the most sarcastic kind of lighting on dark days, Sansa is informed she will marry Tyrion Lannister. The news doesn't arrive as a suggestion, but as a destiny already signed by power itself. Sansa doesn't protest, doesn't cry, doesn't scream. She simply stands there, hands clenched so tightly her knuckles turn white, as if she's just swallowed a truth her throat isn't wide enough to hold. Tyrion is the only one who treats Sansa kindly, which means the system will absolutely punish him for it. A line both cruel and so accurate it chills the spine. Tyrion, the smartest man in the city, the most sarcastic, and also the loneliest, becomes the designated husband of a girl imprisoned in her own life. No one asks Tyrion what he wants. No one asks Sansa what she wants. Everything has already been arranged by Tywin, a man who treats marriage as the fastest way to collect land, collect status, and bind people's fates into his portfolio. On the wedding day, King's Landing decorates itself not to give blessings but to flaunt power. Flags, wine, half-sincere well-wishes, none of it is for love, which is completely absent from the scene. It's all for appearances. Sansa walks down the aisle, each step stamping out the last of her childhood faith. Tyrion stands waiting, cloak perfect, eyes sad enough to soften stone. Surrounded by staring eyes, they look less like a bride and groom and more like two victims forced into roles they never auditioned for. When Sansa must kneel so Tyrion can drape the Lannister cloak over her, Joffrey, evil right down to his bones, deliberately pulls away the stool she needs to stand on. He laughs. The crowd laughs. A tiny, vicious joke, and a perfect symbol. Sansa is not allowed to have a place to stand, not even at her own wedding. Tyrion, unable to stomach the humiliation, threatens loudly to make Joffrey a king missing a few essential parts. It is the only moment in the ceremony that makes Sansa want to smile. And if she feels a spark of warmth toward Tyrion that day, it comes from that moment. The moment he stands on her side, knowing he'll pay the price for it. After the ceremony comes the feast, and in the feast comes cruelty, dressed in flowers, wine, and music. Joffrey, drunk on power more than wine, announces that Sansa will be taken to bed in whatever way he chooses if Tyrion fails to perform his marital duties. This isn't a threat. It's a promise, delivered in a child's voice soaked in sadism. But Tyrion, in a rare moment where the world glimpses his conscience, refuses. The wedding night passes without anything happening. Tyrion lies on the bed facing away, leaving a space between them as wide as both their lives. Sansa lies still, carrying a quiet fear like a second breath. And once again, kindness becomes tragedy. Tyrion protects her in a way no one else in King's Landing ever has, yet she cannot love him, not because he is unworthy, but because her heart has shattered too many times to feel anything new. At her age, people should only be afraid of the dark, but Sansa fears the light, because the light always exposes the truth. Joffrey, who cannot tolerate other people feeling even a sliver of happiness, continues tormenting Sansa simply by existing. He looks at her the way someone looks at a decoration placed in the wrong corner. Every time he walks by, Sansa forces her face still, because in King's Landing, the more visible your fear, the more people use it against you. Sansa lives among serpents while wearing the feathers of a sparrow, and Tyrion, the only person with both heart and helplessness, must watch as she endures everything he cannot stop. Joffrey. Proof that power does not cure stupid. Nothing describes the boy king more accurately. In the darkness of the wedding chamber, Sansa gazes out the window. She sees the moonlight reflecting off the rooftops, the most beautiful thing King's Landing still offers her. But the moonlight doesn't comfort. It only reminds her that the world is vast, while her life grows smaller each day. In a rare moment of vulnerability, she asks Tyrion, "If you could choose, would you have chosen me?" Tyrion is silent for a long time before he answers, "No. And I hope that makes you feel less burdened, not more hurt. A raw truth, a bitter kindness, a duet of two souls trapped in the same cage. Sansa becomes a bride, but no one asks her about love. Tyrion becomes a husband, but no one asks him about happiness. All they ask is, who benefits from this marriage? And the answer, cold, brutal, and unmistakably clear, is King's Landing, not them. There are moments in life when the heart and duty collide like two glaciers, creating a long, cold, unforgettable crack. For Jon Snow, that moment didn't come in battle. It came in the instant he realized that to stay loyal to one thing, he would have to betray another. And the tragedy, as always, is that the thing he must betray is the one he least wants to lose. After living among the Wildlings, Jon begins to understand that they are not the savages the South makes them out to be. They are desperate people fleeing from something Southerners have never seen, death that walks. But understanding doesn't mean belonging. The ideals of the Night's Watch have seeped into Jon's bones since the day he first put on black. And Ygritte, with her red hair like a tiny flame fighting a frozen sky, it is the only thing that makes him hesitate. But every hesitation has a price. In the days leading up to climbing the wall to attack Castle Black, Jon's inner conflict grows. He watches the Wildlings swing axes, sharpen arrows, sprinkle salt on dried meat, everything as natural as breathing. They fight to live. Jon, a spy who's terrible at lying, fights to maintain a role while his heart stands between two cliffs. Deep inside, Jon knows. If the Wildlings cross the wall, the Night's Watch will die. If the Watch dies, the South will be devoured by the White Walkers. And when that happens, the world will have nothing left to love, lose, or dream about. That truth, invisible and sharp as steel, slices at him every night. One evening, in a valley so cold even the wind seemed to flinch, Ygritte looks at Jon the way someone looks at a promise that no longer fits. "If you betray me, Jon Snow, I'll shoot you." A threat? No, a sad prophecy. Jon doesn't answer. He cannot say, "I won't betray you," because that is the one lie he does not dare speak. When the Wildlings attack a group of horse breeders from the south, Jon faces his real test for the first time. He must kill an innocent man to prove loyalty. But Jon Snow, with all his naivety, impracticality, and honesty so pure it borders on useless, cannot do it. And in that moment, his disguise shatters. The Wildlings stare at him, and as their arrows draw back, Jon realizes he cannot stay. He cannot keep lying to people who trusted him halfway, and he absolutely cannot betray the Night's Watch, the birthplace of his ideal. He has to run, not because he fears dying, but because he fears killing the wrong person. Jon didn't run out of fear. He ran because his ideals ran faster. It sounds like a joke, but it perfectly describes the movement inside Jon's soul. Ideals have no legs, but they're what push him forward. The moment Jon swings onto his horse, the Wildlings shout behind him. They aren't calling his name. They're expressing their disappointment, calling the betrayal they believe is absolute. But among those cries, only one sound pierces Jon like a blade to the ribs, Ygritte's voice. She doesn't scream, doesn't wail, doesn't accuse. She draws her bow. When the arrow flies, it isn't the act of an enemy. It's the act of someone who loves a man so much that she cannot let him leave without a wound. Ygritte shoots Jon to teach him one final lesson. Love also requires a choice. The arrow enters Jon's back like a question still burning. Why did you leave her? Why did you choose the oath over your heart? Why must love always demand blood as payment? Jon doesn't stop. He is not allowed to stop. He pulls the reins, gallops through the trees, leaving behind not a battlefield but his own heart, still standing there in the form of a red-haired girl, trembling between love and hate. Ygritte didn't shoot to kill him. If she had wanted that, she would have aimed for his heart. Instead, she shot him in the back. The place where love exists is the body first. When Jon reaches Castle Black, he collapses at the gate like a man who has crawled back from another world. The arrow is still lodged in his flesh, blood still dripping. But the real pain isn't there. It lives in what he left behind, a love crushed under the weight of duty. The Night's Watch carries him inside. They look at him like a man who escaped hell. But Jon, exhausted, ribs broken, breath cracking like ice, can only think of one thing. Is Ygritte alive? Does she understand? Will she forgive him? And the answer, like all painful answers, sinks into silence. In the dark room, while Pip and Sam try to pull the arrow from Jon's body, Sam jokes, the kind of humor only desperate men attempt. She must have really loved you, Jon. She shot you, but didn't kill you. Jon doesn't laugh. He simply closes his eyes, and the world slides away from him like a snowflake melting in his hand. No one betrayed Jon Snow. He only betrayed his own heart. There are choices in life that make us lose something even when we are right. This is one of them. Jon Snow has returned to the Night's Watch, but he has left himself behind in that frozen forest where a red-haired girl stands staring into the dark, searching for answers inside the arrow she released. And perhaps love, like an arrow, sometimes must be shot not to kill, but to remind someone that they walked away from what mattered most. Ygritte knows that, Jon knows that, but knowing is not enough to save them from fate. There are moments in history when a smile is more terrifying than a scream. The Red Wedding is one of those moments. People remember it for the blood, for the choking cries of those who never got to speak their last words, for the silence after the storm. But before all of that, before the first knife slipped from a sleeve, before the first bowstring tightened, there was a feast so cheerful it felt wrong. At the Twins, House Frey welcomed the Stark entourage as if receiving honored guests. Lights shimmered, music echoed, meat roasted to perfect golden crispness, wine flowed as though no grudge had ever existed between the two houses. If you didn't know the context, you might think this was a celebration of victory, not a gathering between two families who nearly tore each other apart on the battlefield. But that is precisely what made the feast frightening. Peace, especially the kind hosted by a Frey, it is always the easiest thing to break. When the Starks entered the Great Hall, no one foresaw what was coming. Catelyn, guided by a mother's instinct sharpened by too much loss, sensed something strange immediately. Nothing concrete, no clear sign, just the feeling of stepping into a room where someone had quietly changed the locks. Robb Stark tried to smile, tried to take control, tried to believe that marrying Talisa had been a mistake, but one that could be fixed with goodwill and honor. But goodwill and honor, as history has proven again and again, these are commodities with no market value at the Twins. Walder Frey sat upon his high seat, eyes sharp as needles, breath heavy with bitterness. He looked at Robb the way a hunter looks at the last deer, foolish enough to return to his woods. And his smile, if one could call it that, was the distorted grin of a soul that had fermented too long in resentment. Walder Frey wasn't angry at Robb for breaking his betrothal. He was angry because he wasn't respected. Nothing is more dangerous than a man who feels the world owes him something, especially when the world has no idea it made such a debt. Music swelled. Laughter rippled across the tables, glasses clinked. Talisa sat beside Robb, her hand resting lightly on his in one of the few moments where love was allowed to exist during wartime. Catelyn watched them, her heart warming and hurting at the same time. She knew her son's mistake had not come from malice, it had come from the heart, and the heart is always the worst advisor in war. Across the hall, Frey's daughters were paraded out like dusty auction items. Frey hurled jabs, missing no opportunity to remind Robb that he had rejected one of them. Every word he spoke was dipped in salt, sharp, stinging, deliberately hurtful. But small pains do not raise alarms. The greater pain, the real pain, was still waiting behind the door. Amid the laughter, Catelyn glanced at the musicians and suddenly noticed something no one else had. These were not the familiar faces of the twins. A chill slid down her spine, not because she understood the truth, but because a mother knows when death is hiding in the corner of a room. She checked the servants' eyes. They weren't looking at guests. They weren't looking at Frey. They were looking at each other. But in a feast, every instinct is diluted by wine, and tonight's wine was very strong. Robb, trying to salvage the alliance, raised a cup in toast. Frey smiled, a coarse, crackling smile, like rotten wood breaking under a traveler's step. In the candlelight, his smile looked like a door about to shut, a door Robb didn't realize he was standing beneath. Catelyn looked over at Edmure, her cousin, glowing with a kind of happiness that was concerning. A man who is happy at the twins is always a sign that misfortune is about to strike someone else. The red wedding begins with cheerful music because no one wants to die in silence. If someone had written that line at that very moment, it would have perfectly captured the irony of the night. The brightest smiles often belong to people who have no idea they're about to lose everything. Then, the fateful moment arrived like an uninvited breeze. The music changed. Not much, not abruptly, but enough. Catelyn recognized the melody first. The Rains of Castamere, the Lannisters' song, the song of wiping things out, the song of death. Her entire body froze, not because the song itself was frightening, but because it should never, ever have been played at a Frey wedding. She turned toward Rose Bolton, the strange guest with the emotionless face. Bolton smiled, but it was not a smile of celebration. It was the smile of a man who had signed a contract and was merely waiting for delivery. Catelyn placed her hand on his sleeve and touched armor under ceremonial clothing. In that instant, time stopped. No more laughter, no more music, only the sound of truth falling into her mind like a blade. They are going to kill us. She shot to her feet, but it was too late. A hidden archer drew back his bowstring. Another narrowed his eyes. Another smiled. And at the head of the hall, Walder Frey lifted his cup. The wine inside seemed fuller, as if it had already swallowed blood no one had seen it spill yet. And in the final moment of this chapter, only one image remained. Robb is still smiling at Talisa. Talisa is still resting her hand on her belly, where a new life was growing. Catelyn opened her mouth, unable to force out the warning. And history, the cruelest storyteller of all, turning the page in red ink. There are moments when history no longer flows like a river. It drops, straight down like a blade. The Red Wedding, from the instant the music shifted into the Rains of Castamere, was exactly that kind of moment. A moment when every trace of kindness was pulled out of the world, making room for a refined, winter-cold kind of betrayal, the kind tempered like steel soaked in ice. Catelyn Stark saw the truth before it reached anyone else. In Walder Frey's eyes, she saw not anger, not humiliation, but satisfaction. The satisfaction of a man who believes he has just corrected a flaw in the universe. And that flaw, according to him, was the Stark family daring to treat House Frey as though it were beneath them. Catelyn's hand trembled as she opened her mouth to scream. but the scream never left her throat, because the first arrow had already fallen from the balcony. No one had time to turn their head. No one had time to stand. No one had time to understand. Robb looked at Talisa, wanting to say something, anything, but instead, he watched an arrow sink into her body, watched the next ones follow, watched them drive into her belly like blades severing a future that had barely begun to exist. That moment was so cruel that time split in two, one half where Robb was still a husband, a soon-to-be father, a leader, the other half where he was nothing more than a man watching his life being torn apart right before his eyes. Screams rose like the cries of hunted animals. Stark soldiers, unarmored, unarmed, unprepared, fell one by one. Blood soaked into tablecloths, wedding gowns, and the untouched wine still shining in crystal cups. Servants slammed the doors. The bolts dropped. The last hope dissolved. The red wedding was not a battle. It was a liquidation. Honor is something you bring to a feast, not something you get to take home. In that moment, if anyone still had the luxury of thinking at all, that line would have summarized the downfall of House Stark perfectly. Robb knelt beside Talisa, his trembling hand touching her cheek. Her eyes were open, surprised, pained, and carrying something else. The injustice of a love cut short not by wrongdoing, but by the calculations of people who had never loved anyone but themselves. There was no music for this moment, no miracle. Only a young man is watching the future disappear from the world. With the last strength she had, Catelyn lunged toward Roose Bolton. In her mind, he was still an ally, a man who had shared food, war, and winter with them. But when her hand clutched his sleeve, she felt it. Armor. Roose Bolton had worn armor to a wedding. No one wears armor to a feast, unless they know someone else will not be going home. Bolton looked at her and allowed himself a small smile, the smile of a man who has already signed the contract and is merely waiting for delivery. Then he whispered, soft as a breeze, heavy as a death sentence, "The Lannisters send their regards." That moment wasn't an attack. It was confirmation that everything had been arranged, everything decided, everything inevitable. Every bit of goodness in Catelyn's life, every sacrifice, every act of endurance, it was not enough to stop a man who believed the world ran on cold logic. Bolton stabbed Robb. No remorse, no rage, no joy, just business, as though signing the final page of an agreement dissolving a kingdom. In a mother's primal desperation, Catelyn seized a Frey girl and pressed a knife to her throat. She didn't want to kill. She wanted to trade one life to save another. But Walder Frey, a man who had lived too long and seen too few decent things, simply shrugged. He knew Robb was already dead. He knew the North's future was dead. He knew Catelyn's plea was nothing more than the last exhale of a mother who had nothing left to lose. No countdown, no mercy. No one is listening. When Catelyn slit the girl's throat, it was not cruelty. It was despair. The attempt of someone trying to delay the truth by one more heartbeat. But truth waits for no one, and it came on another blade, the blade that opened Catelyn's neck, cutting off her broken scream, a scream that, if the world were kinder, might have been heard from the start of the feast. Outside the great hall, Frey soldiers hunted down the remaining Stark loyalists. Wolf banners burned. Bodies were thrown into the river. Knights who once shouted "King in the North" fell like brittle autumn leaves in poisoned wind. The twins, once a promise of alliance, had become a cemetery for hope. And Robb did not scream, did not beg, did not run. He simply stared ahead, at a point where everything he believed in had dissolved. In the final second, the thing that hurts most is not death, it is the death of belief. Walder Frey regarded Robb's body as though admiring a finished painting, distorted, ugly, but perfectly aligned with his intentions. Catelyn lay nearby, eyes open but seeing nothing. Her grief dissolved into the cold air. Robb's grief dissolved into silence. And the fall of House Stark dissolved into a song no one wants to sing, But history forces us to remember, even honor can be ambushed. When the night finally closed, the twins sat in a sickening quiet. No music, no laughter, only the sound of blood dripping onto stone, each drop marking the collapse of the North. This was the Red Wedding. Not the death of a king, but the death of the idea that this world rewards the good. If the Red Wedding was the deepest cut into the heart of the North, then the battle at Castle Black was a knife driven straight into whatever fragile faith the world had left. Some battles are recorded in history books, celebrated in great halls, and immortalized in heroic songs. And then there are battles like this, where the people fighting will never be named, where the survivors will never be thanked, and where victory is the one thing they are forbidden to celebrate. The Night's Watch at this point was not the army legend once praised. It was a group of men more ragged than their own armor, starving, exhausted, fractured, half mutinous. Some were still causing chaos at Craster's Keep. Some were frozen in the snow. Some had never believed in the mission to begin with. To put it bluntly, the Night's Watch was standing thanks to two things: the Wall and stubbornness. The Night's Watch wins because the Wall's taller than the average IQ of both sides. A cruel line and terrifyingly accurate. While Castle Black scraped together whatever remained of its sanity into something resembling a defensive line, the Wildling attack began. Like wildfire catching from all sides, they surged from the forests, the foothills, the gate. Mance Rayder's horn echoed across the night like the final sigh of a world trying to outrun a death colder than any blade. Jon Snow, bandaged, exhausted, still had to stand. No time to mourn Ygritte, no time to think about the arrows once lodged in his back, no time to choose who the enemy even was. This was no longer a battle between Wildlings and the Night's Watch. This was a battle between survival and extinction. But of course, as usual, the world only noticed who was climbing the wall. When the alarm bell rang, Castle Black shifted from silence to chaos in a single breath. Men ran, chains rattled, the gate was pulled shut, boiling oil was lifted, arrows stacked in grooves. No one looked like a hero, they just looked scared. And that fear, unintentionally, was exactly what made them fight like the end of the world was here. Samwell Tarly, the man who had once killed a White Walker using the collective luck of all his ancestors, rushed to find a position. His hands shook, his lips shook, everything shook, but he still went. Because at Castle Black, if you didn't fight, you'd die from something worse than arrows, the judgment of the survivors. Jon placed his hand on Longclaw and knew. They could not lose this. Not for honor, but if they died here, no one in the South would even know they ever existed. Below, the Wildlings fired blindly at the wall. Giants roared, pulling gates that weighed more than houses as if they were curtains. Above, the Night's Watch shot back, not in formations, not in tactics, just pure, desperate instinct. And in that chaos, Jon saw her. Ygritte, standing in the shadow below, her red hair like a flame trying to survive a storm of snow. Her eyes, even through the rain of arrows, were fixed on him, not in hatred, but with a question. Why? No one dies simply from being looked at. But Jon felt as though a second arrow had already pierced his ribs. The battle had no structure. The Night's Watch didn't have enough men to close the gaps. The Wildlings didn't have enough discipline to exploit them. One side had wind, one side had fire, both sides had too much despair. On the ground below, Pip, the kindest smile in the Night's Watch, fell with an arrow through his neck. Gren, who had always seen Jon as a brother, stood at the tunnel gate, facing down a giant, reciting the Night's Watch oath with a trembling but unwavering voice. They didn't die for victory. They died hoping, foolishly, desperately, that someone south of the wall might someday live longer than they did. But the true tragedy of this battle wasn't Gren, nor Pip, nor all the nameless dead. It was the final meeting between Jon and Ygritte, Jon sprinted across the courtyard, dodging arrows, axes, bodies, everything except her gaze. In that instant, the war vanished. Only two people remained, standing in a snowstorm, seeing each other as if for the first time. Ygritte drew her bow, the arrow aimed at him, but her eyes told another story. They were not the eyes of an enemy. They were the eyes of someone trying to remember a moment she had already lost. The warm cave, the dripping water, the shared breath, the promise that never got the chance to be kept. Jon opened his mouth to speak, an apology, a confession, a greeting, anything. But he couldn't, because the arrow flew. Not hers. Ollie's. The boy whose family had been slaughtered by Wildlings. His vengeance arrived at the one moment it should not have. Ygritte looked down at the arrow in her chest, as though it were the final riddle of the world. Then she looked up at Jon, weakening but smiling through the pain, a smile containing everything she couldn't say. "You know nothing, Jon Snow." It was no longer reproach, no longer teasing. It was farewell, the kind of love made sharper by heartbreak. Jon held her as she slipped away, surrounded by blood and snow, giants roaring and men screaming. There was no war in that embrace, no watch, no Wildlings, only a man mourning a choice both of them knew would one day destroy them. And then she went still, light as the first snow of winter. The battle ended when Mance Rayder realized his forces were split and exposed. The Night's Watch survived, not because of strategy, but because the wall was thick and everyone was too terrified to run. Morning came. Castle Black was carpeted with bodies, no songs, no histories, no statues, a victory no one wanted, a victory without reward, a victory proving one thing. To become a leader, Jon Snow only had to outlive everyone else. But survival isn't a blessing, it's a burden, one that forces him to carry the grief of everyone who died to keep him alive. In the snow, beside Ygritte's body, Jon understood. The real battle had never been at the wall. It was inside him, where love and duty had just destroyed each other. There are seasons in history when people don't live hoping for something better. They live only to see which disaster arrives first. Season 3 of Westeros ends exactly like that, not with a flicker of light, not with a promise, but with open wounds, unanswered cries, and a cold that crawls straight into the hearts of everyone still standing. The Red Wedding killed Robb Stark, killed Catelyn Stark, killed even the naive dream that the North might rise again. But worse than death was the void left behind, a silence so heavy that even the wind seemed afraid to blow through it, as if it might carry more grief than it could bear. Meanwhile, in the South, the Lannisters raised their cups to a victory they believed would secure their power for another generation. But history, with its trademark mocking laughter, always finds a way to remind people that victories gained too easily are often the most dangerous ones. In King's Landing, Tywin Lannister sat behind his desk, writing letters as though the entire kingdom were just a balance sheet. To him, the Red Wedding wasn't a massacre. It was resource optimization, the cost of peace. The quickest way to end a war. But what Tywin never calculated, what no one can ever calculate, is the seed of hatred. Hatred doesn't die with bodies. It dies when the last person forgets. And the North does not forget. Ever. On the other side of the world, Daenerys Targaryen faced a different problem entirely. She had won. And victory, the thing every would-be conqueror craves, tests the human soul far more than defeat. Meereen was still ahead, but Astapor and Yunkai had already forced a single enormous question onto her path. Can a liberator become a ruler? Liberation is a moment. Ruling is a lifetime. Daenerys stood on the balcony of Yunkai, watching thousands call her Misa. Their voices filled the square below like a religion being born in real time. That kind of adoration can intoxicate, more than wine, stronger than magic. But what Daenerys didn't tell anyone was the fear simmering inside her. How do you rule people who don't see you as a queen but as a savior? People obey a queen. People depend on a saint. And dependence, when it arrives too quickly, can become a new kind of shackle. Daenerys was learning what all great leaders eventually learn. Victory doesn't create order. It creates expectation, and expectation is the hardest thing on earth to rule. In the north, Jon Snow, having lost Ygritte and countless brothers, faced a different kind of grief. The battle at Castle Black had ended, but the battle inside him hadn't. Jon stood before the wall, the wind slapping his face as if trying to remind him that everything he'd lost was never coming back. The woman he loved, the people he swore to protect. Love, duty. Two blades crashing together, leaving a wound that would never fully heal. In a rare quiet night, Sam asked, "Are you all right, Jon?" Jon stared into the distant fires and replied, "What does all right even mean?" A simple question. But within it lay the entire weight of Season 3. No one was all right. Not the North. Not the men at the wall. Not the souls across the sea in Essos. The world was stepping into a new order, one built from corpses and the remains of things that no longer existed. Sansa Stark, in King's Landing, continued living among the human-shaped serpents. She moved through the Red Keep like a shadow, trying to make herself smaller, quieter, less visible, because that was the only way to survive in a hive full of people who saw kindness as weakness and tears as opportunity. And with each passing day, Sansa learned what her mother had always known. Hope is the most expensive currency in this city. Tyrion, her husband in name only, tried to protect her as much as he could. But King's Landing is no place for the decent, and so, the kinder Tyrion became, the deeper he sank into the political cage his own family had built around him. Joffrey, meanwhile, behaved like a child who believed the throne was a toy and the world a stage for his cruelty. But the horror of children is that they don't understand consequences, and the horror of children with power is that consequences arrive even faster. At Dragonstone, Stannis, the only man who still cared about the real threat in the north, began gathering his strength. After Davos freed Gendry, Stannis looked as though he had finally awakened from a long religious fog. He didn't hear the letter from the Night's Watch with his ears. He heard it with the soul of a man who had already glimpsed darkness. Melisandre did not object. She only smiled, knowing that the fire of Arheller wanted that war too. The Lannisters were busy celebrating. The Tyrells were busy consolidating power. The Freys were busy patting themselves on the back. The Boltons were busy tailoring new suits of armor. No one looked north, and that, precisely, is why Stannis still mattered. Someone had to look into the dark, even when everyone else turned away. Season 3 ends without cheering, without joy, without promises. It ends with a truth. Every faction believes it has won, but in reality, none of them have. There are only survivors. Daenerys survives, but is trapped in the role of a saint. Jon survives, but has lost the only person who could melt the snow around him. Sansa survives, but in a gilded prison. Tyrion survives, but knows his life is cheaper than any decision his father might make. Stannis survives, but is treated as a political ghost. The Lannisters survive, but plant 1,000 more enemies. The Freys survive, but carve their names into the list of history's most hated. And the North? The North has no king. But it still has fury. A kind of resource history has repeatedly proven to be endless. Season 3 closes like a door with the wind howling through its cracks, cold, long, and carrying a warning the world has not yet understood. Hope didn't die at the Red Wedding. Hope died in Season 1. The Red Wedding was just the moment everyone finally realized it.